Hello, today I would like to introduce our speaker, Craig Lebowitz from Nokia. The title of his presentation is Effects of COVID-19 Lockdowns on Service Providers.
Great, well, thank you. So today I'll be speaking about work we've been doing in conjunction with, give or take, about 50 of our customers around the world, including many of the large CSPs in the US, in Europe, and in Latin America. While I won't go into the details, much of what we're doing today and how we normalize the data really is very similar to talks I've given in the past, both at SIGCOMM and NANOG, now going back a decade or more. But essentially, we've had the ability working with our partners to collect real-time telemetry, namely data like IPFix, gRPC, SNMP data for capacity from large backbone providers around the world. While unfortunately not every CSP is our customer, we do have a significant portion of the large carriers and the large transit providers, both, as I said, in North America, Europe, as well as a global transit. In this talk, we were looking at specifically how the traffic volumes, application mixes, video quality, specifically video streaming rate, and capacity and security evolved over the last 8 or 10 weeks during the COVID lockdown and network changes. I think the main takeaway that we have, and isn't unique and certainly not to anyone listening to this talk, is just the massive growth in traffic, particularly looking at peak hour, usually 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. local time, usually Saturday or Sunday nights around the world. In the matter of just a few days or in just a week, we've watched traffic grow really 30 to 45%, in some cases 60% over the previous weeks before the immediate lockdowns. I think the good news in all of the data, as we particularly look at capacity and look at things like congestion and video rates, is that the networks mostly met the demand and were able to maintain significant levels of QoE HD video stream rates throughout the pandemic and the pandemic lockdown. And, when I began with NANOG, we had Bob Metcalf talking about the end of the internet and the collapse of the internet in the 95 timeframe. I think it is real testament to the capability in the network, the maturity of the network and engineering practices, that the networks were able to handle a load. We saw significant turn-ups where possible at Equinix, at other exchanges. We saw a number of providers such as Zoom add capacity through the cloud. And we saw really flexibility both within the network and the network engineering and within things like Netflix and YouTube policy to be able to maintain quality video rates throughout the epidemic, as well as very flexible policy, settlement peering by Telefonica and others. So, obviously the pandemic began in Asia-Pac, and we watched it as both the lockdowns and the pandemic spread through Europe and then through the US. What you're seeing here is a graph of one large European provider where we've graphed week over week, beginning with the week of March 1st and the next 4 weeks of traffic. You'll notice the gray line down at the bottom is the sort of pre-pandemic traffic. We saw really the Wednesday in the first week of March, the Call of Duty upgrade, which at the time set a new record for the backbone in terms of peak traffic. It was only a week later, of course, as we look at the yellow and the red line, we saw the traffic levels not only match, but exceed the previous records and continue to grow. I think the pattern we see in this one European provider over the course of 4 weeks is similar to what we saw in Latin, Asia, and US providers, though the exact percentage and numbers may vary. Overall, the immediate concern during the first week of the pandemic was, would the 30 to 40% growth continue week after week? And how long would it continue? In many networks, the first 2 weeks of the lockdown saw steady growth. The main concern, of course, being is that networks usually have the capacity to add 40, 45% growth over the course of the year. Few networks can add 40, 45% growth for multiple weeks indefinitely. And here's just another view looking at now data normalized across a collection of US, European and Latin American providers. The two things to notice in this graph are both the Sunday night peaks are growing, but it's also what's interesting to us is the width. We used to see peak bandwidth for really about just 2 or 3 hours a night and typically just on weekends. You'll notice through the graph that what normally was the very jagged peaks now become much smoother, and we see much longer periods of sustained bandwidth, largely driven by video. Just drilling into the US provides a little bit of comparison across 3 providers in the US. As I said earlier, every provider is a little bit different. Some providers, in fact, lost traffic that had mostly enterprise customers. Other providers with large consumer bases saw significant growth. Again, we're graphing 4 providers with the Sunday, the first week, at least in the US, March 8th in orange, followed by gray, yellow, blue, and green. And you'll notice, as I said earlier, that we saw initially in provider A, for example, sustained growth for multiple weeks in a row, really raising concern about where would we hit peak video. I think we had lots of debates internally whether, what in fact was peak video. There are only so many videos, only so many subscribers, only so many devices to watch YouTube or Netflix or Hulu or Disney. So indeed, we do seem to have reached peak video at 30, 40% above normal, varies by network. Some networks here are only 20%, and the traffic subsequently either leveled off or has now dropped off of the initial peaks from the second or third week of the pandemic. The growth in overall traffic, both peak traffic and sustained traffic during the day, was driven by a significant change in the applications. While the growth in video conferencing, mainly Zoom and WhatsApp and Skype, were the most significant percentage growth based on application usage previously, obviously Netflix at 20, 30% of some networks, a 58% growth in Netflix will have a significant impact, far larger than video conferencing, on the overall bandwidth. So mix of all applications grew, particularly the video conferencing. In terms of sort of peak bandwidth and network capacity, we were, of course, largely focused on the large video streaming applications, being things like Netflix and YouTube. And as you notice again on the graph on the right, the curves also look very different from the previous pre-pandemic, both the jagged peaks getting flatter and much longer sustained bandwidth use. I think the other thing I found interesting when looking at the data was just how intrinsically tied the internet has become to daily life, to the point where you can see speeches, in this case Macron's speech on March 17th or 16th, where you can see during the period of his speech the significant dip in overall network bandwidth. And we see on the 2 graphs on the bottom right-hand side of the page, you can see that during the speech, we saw the dip in the OTT, the global OTT, the Netflix, the YouTube, the video, and the corresponding growth in some of the real-time live streaming, Canal and TF1 streaming applications. I think you'll also see, as we look farther on the right-hand side, you'll see the drop in the peering corresponding to the change in the video mix as well. Not only Macron's speech, but it turns out we can also see on an almost daily basis the dip in traffic during the 8 p.m. Cacophony of pots and pans and yells and music in both Europe and many US cities celebrating the frontline healthcare workers, to the point where we generally were seeing a 10% dip in aggregate traffic across most applications. You will notice, though, it wasn't all applications. In particular, gaming traffic does not show any of this dip, reflecting both difference in sort of user base applications or, perhaps age group with the rest of the applications. I think what was also impressive, not only did the networks continue to function and maintain a relatively high level of QoE, particularly with respect to video, but we also saw new both game launches and new video launches, namely, for example, Disney Plus launch in Europe on the 24th. And Disney Plus was interesting in that, unlike perhaps Netflix or GGC and OpenConnect, largely relying on the old BAMTech infrastructure, providing CDN video over the peering links. So it represents about 8% of the total video traffic in some European networks post-launch, but about 18 to 20% of the overall video peering. So really significant added impact on the infrastructure during the midst of the pandemic and subsequent lockdowns. Just another view of the change in applications. You'll see in this graph, we're looking at WebEx, Skype, and Zoom over the course of the first several weeks in March. And while all video traffic, particularly video conferencing traffic, grew, the real increase we saw really was Zoom, with a 700 to 1,000% growth in the overall number of total bytes during a day, as well as a sort of lesser but corresponding percentage growth in the overall peak volume. So really significant shift in the way the internet is being used, new application being used by millions of subscribers in the US, Europe, Latin, and Asia. I think it was also interesting watching both Zoom as well as other providers begin to adjust in the flexibility of the network, particularly flexibility in peering, flexibility in CDN, flexibility in ways to shift cloud compute. You'll notice that before the pandemic, Zoom was largely using traffic from their own ASN, and as the pandemic progressed, switching to Amazon and then later to Oracle to really support the 700,000% growth in traffic. So again, real testament, I think, to the flexibility of the networks we have been building. Just a quick, another kind of view of looking at Zoom. In this case, we're looking at week over week again across different providers. And again, you'll notice that it varied from provider to provider, but really significant growth, particularly not driven by business, but particularly looking at Sundays, looking at the growth in video conferencing. Both Saturday and Sunday is really where we saw the dominant portion of the video conferencing growth. So certainly played a role during the weekday, but really significant change as we begin to look at the weekends. Again, just another view of the data. You'll see again, week over week growth, looking at different providers compared to the first week in March. Again, growth ranging from 30, 40, 50, even higher percent growth. The gaming traffic on the bottom is showing some interesting patterns because it reflects both interactive gaming as well as we continue to see new updates, new game downloads throughout the pandemic. So again, watching kind of the network continue throughout. Now we're getting to some of the slides that I actually find the most significant. One of the things we looked at was really the percent of both CDN capacity and peering capacity, and in particular, how capacity related to things like video stream rate. What you're seeing in this graph is a fairly typical graph for a number of European countries, where in the column data on the bottom, we're showing the number of simultaneous streams. That is, Nokia Deep Field is looking at, on a per individual subscriber, AAA record basis, how many unique streams, potentially using multiple CDN or multiple OpenConnect, how many unique streams are watching, in this case, Netflix. And we are calculating what is the average stream rate on a per AAA, per subscriber basis. You'll notice that as we look at before the pandemic, we are seeing something in the range of 4 megabits. We see the change, a fairly abrupt change, as we get to March 22nd in the top line, seeing the shift down to something below 3.6 megabits per second, corresponding with Netflix announcement of their default policy changing the stream rate for content in an effort to help offload what then was a concern about congestion in some of the European networks. So overall, I think the impressive thing in this graph is despite the 40, in some cases 60% growth in networks, we were able to see most of the major video providers maintain consistent video stream rates, with the exception of explicit policy changes, as shown here for Netflix. This similarly is now looking at a US provider looking at YouTube. Normally YouTube is a mix and less HD traffic than Netflix, so it's normally a much lower sort of average stream rate. And you can see that at least in this US provider, the Netflix rate remained mostly consistent at a fairly high, 4.5, give or take, megabits per second stream rate per AAA subscriber record. Whereas we do see what looks to be like a policy shift for YouTube, where we saw the stream rate at or about March 26 change. The other thing I think that was interesting as we both looked at stream rates, we also looked at how the traffic was being delivered. I previously discussed Zoom and their shift from their own ASN to begin to use Amazon and other infrastructure. At least in several European networks, we saw some interesting shifts for things like on-net Open Connect delivery versus peering. And again, I mainly find this interesting given how robust the network has become and the flexibility for how content can be delivered and shift over time. Before the pandemic, we roughly saw 60 to 70% of Netflix traffic coming from on-net Open Connect CDN. Again, this is anecdotally looking at a couple of European providers, with 30%, give or take, coming across the peering links. Immediately after the pandemic, we saw a fairly significant shift, basically almost a reversal, where now the majority of the traffic shifting over peering over the on-net CDN. And I think it would be an interesting discussion with the application providers on the factors going into this. But again, does reflect that as both the usage changes, as perhaps the catalog changes, the flexibility of the network to be able to continue to deliver. I'll come to the last slide for today. And this is the one, perhaps, of all the good news in terms of the network being able to maintain QoE and absorb the 30, 40, even higher percent growth. We have been watching a fairly abrupt growth in the overall volume, as well as sort of simultaneous peak GPPS, terabits per second, as well as the daily volume, which is graphed here in denial of service traffic. Normally, we see a significant correspondence with denial of service traffic with things like games and other types of applications. In this case, we've watched a 40% sort of sustained growth rate over the last several weeks from February, at least through the first week of April graphed here, but it's also continued in the overall volume of DDoS. That doesn't seem directly tied to, say, the growth in gaming traffic or others. So something we're watching. It is concerning, of course, as the internet has become increasingly important during the time of the pandemic, watching abuse of the network, DDoS, as well as other types of attacks reported by many other security companies. So that's just kind of a quick overview, and I will be happy to answer any questions. So thank you.
Hi. Now we have some questions. If you have any questions, please submit them through the question box. Our first question is, on slide 3, you reference over the last 4 weeks. Is that basically all of May, or is the baseline date some other prior date?
Yeah, I have to now refresh my memory of what the slide is on 3. So let me take a quick look. But yeah, so the immediate growth on slide 3 of the 30 to 60%, was really over the March, April timeframe is what we're referring to on slide 3.
Okay. And the question is, are there any, obviously you talked a little bit about Netflix requesting lower bit rate, or have you seen anything on bit rates being throttled in your data?
I guess it depends what, so I think when I use change in bit rates, it really was policy, whether it be codecs, whether it be, different sort of policy changes. There's still some evidence around the world of some throttling, but typically not in most large European or US carriers. We typically have not seen historically and did not see any, I think, in the sense of the question, intentional throttling as a question intended. We do see, however, I think a lot more interest with traffic engineering, particularly in being able to engineer around gaming comes up quite a bit, interactive applications, and how do you prioritize different types of traffic over, say, large downloads or progressive, HTTP download, which are more tolerant.
Okay. Have you seen any specific data on Central America, specifically Panama or Guatemala, possible that would show possible the future network growth? Do your numbers show anything for that region?
Yeah, unfortunately, I only had 20 minutes or so in the presentation. We do actually have customers that we've been collaborating with in Latin and Central America. If folks want to reach out to me, offline, my email is readily available. Happy to share some insights. But generally, we have been seeing similar trends, whether it be in Asia Pac, Europe, as to the effect of the pandemic. There are, of course, always and continue to be regional differences in the application mix when the lockdowns occurred and other sorts of network responses.
Another question we have is, what was your biggest surprise that you saw in the data?
I think the biggest surprise was, I grew up in an internet, as I mentioned during the talk, where we were surprised back in 2000 and 1995. Not that people could take the network down, but just the network staying up. So I think I was really pleasantly surprised just to see how much of a sort of non-issue, the really significant spikes in traffic, how well the network performed. And the network's just come such a long way than, the first few NANOGs where we were all rushing around just trying to keep the network working. So really impressive level of engineering, really people working throughout the pandemic to add capacity, to make engineering changes. So, really great testament to the NANOG and other engineering communities, how well the network performed.
Okay, our next question is, do you see any regional differences between ISPs? Example, regions with higher densities of workers who could work from home. Do you see anything on that?
Yeah, even in the US, there's significant differences between some of the carriers that are more middle of the country, where typically we've got, different sort of traffic mix from more of the coastal. So there's certainly differences. But, generally, while the proportions differ, the general trends remain the same, which is really significant uptick in messaging, video conferencing, VPN. I will say, actually, one of the areas where we have seen capacity issues is not necessarily the network itself, but I think we have seen a number of enterprises that suddenly had an unexpected, not planned for uptick in just the number of simultaneous VPN connections. So, certainly some interesting challenges when we get to the application level and the VPN and the networks.
Okay. Did you notice any shift in protocol version? For example, version IPv6 versus IPv4 within this event?
So only so far as video. So it turns out most IPv6 is really from 5 companies in the network, which are the Facebook, the Netflix, the other video providers. So generally the V4, V6 mix tends to really depend on what 4 or 5 of those are doing and what proportionally is happening to the level of Netflix or Facebook traffic in the network. But if the question is, did we suddenly see new increases in V6 from other applications and other sources? No. Generally remained in line with the large video providers that have long driven most of the V6 traffic.
Okay. Could you talk about any CDN specific challenges during this pandemic?
So, again, we work with CDN providers. So I think a CDN operator would, maybe in the panel coming next, be far better suited to speak towards challenges they faced. I think what we did see evidence of course, is interesting changes in the mix of on-net versus sort of off-net peering. We also saw significant increases in cache updates, sort of origin fill and sort of, traffic from, origin servers to the edge. So, clearly I think there was a lot of work going on in the different CDN providers as they adjusted to the traffic mix, both at sort of an engineering, at a cache fill level, and, as I mentioned earlier, there were public announcements by several of the content providers on changes to policy to try to reduce the overall impact on the network. But as I said, I think panelists actually work for CDN or providers would be better suited to speak to their challenges.
Okay. There's another question on the Netflix rate that was only done in Europe. Do you see any data about North America? Were there any bit rates changes?
I did not see the bitrate changes in North America. And as I said, I was fairly impressed to see the bitrate with a 40% growth in traffic remain basically flat throughout the period. So I was expecting to see some impact. Perhaps I read too many news articles about the end of the internet and collapse of traffic, but none of that seemed to actually come true in North America. Albeit, of course, there were selective hotspots, particularly on the edge and other parts of the network, but largely no.
On the DDoS traffic that you noticed, did it have any effect on the bitrate of application traffic, or was it sufficiently mitigated from your view?
Yeah, so I think DDoS is kind of an interesting beast. DDoS peaks don't normally correspond with video peaks. DDoS, mostly we were interested in looking at DDoS in aggregate, since looking at DDoS in any single time frame is very sort of noisy data set. So we're mostly looking in aggregate and mostly looking at DDoS as a sort of longitudinal trend, and somewhat concerned to see it growing faster than all other applications, at least as a relative percentage during the pandemic. But certainly when there is a DDoS, we do see impact on the network. In the analysis we were doing, we were just looking at an aggregate, not specific time slices or in specific providers, where you'd see the impact, at least for that period of the DDoS. So it just wasn't the analysis we did. Mostly we were interested to understand or to see that DDoS is growing as one of the fastest growing applications as a percentage during the pandemic.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much. Those are all the questions that we have time for. This concludes this session.
Thank you.